Radio 4, 50 years of royal broadcasts, a history of our times as reflected in BBC broadcasts of ceremonial occasions and speeches of the royal family from 1924 to 1974. The narrator is Robert Hudson.
Coronation of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on the 2nd of June, 1953. The magic of the monarchy at its most potent. It's one of the curious political facts of the Western world that the monarchy as an institution has survived only in those countries which are the most stable and liberal of the democracies. And in no country is this paradox more striking than in Britain. Republicanism as a movement is dead. Even the various attempts to democratize the monarchy have never made much headway. The British want the pomp and ceremony, the majesty, if you like. They want their royal family to ride in golden coaches, not on bicycles. They want them both splendidly human and splendidly remote, a true family at the heart of the nation's affairs. So the British monarchy has survived, basically unaltered, the age of the common man and the arrival of those powerful forces, radio and television. Indeed, it was soon clear that the monarchy and knew how to use these new instruments effectively, as we can hear in this first ever Christmas broadcast by King George V in 1932.
Through one of the marvels of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my peoples throughout the empire. I take it as a good omen that wireless should have reached its present perfection at a time when the empire has been linked in closer union. For it offers us immense possibilities to make that union closer still. I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all. To men and women so cut off by the snows, the desert, or the sea, that only voices out of the air can reach them.
But this was not, of course, the first broadcast ever made by a British monarch. That happened in 1924, when King George V opened the British Empire exhibition at Wembley.
I declare the British Empire exhibition open, and I pray that by the blessing of God it may conduce to the unity and prosperity of all my people the world.
From those days of rather indifferent sound, the new medium of radio swiftly developed both technically and as a means of entertainment, until by the 30s it was very much part of the life of the nation.
This is the national program. Now we're going to take you over to Wimbledon for a running commentary on the All-English Championship by Colonel Brand.
In the church cantatas of Bach, there exists a superb treasure of music which is practically unknown to the English public.
Now to turn to something thoroughly English, here is a fine record of the Yeoman of England, sung by Peter Dawson.
Now, here is Marion Cran, who is going to give you another of her...
The BBC also reflected the grimmer realities of the economic situation, growing unemployment, the monetary crisis. Listeners heard King George V open the World Economic Conference in London in 1933.
It is with a feeling of deep responsibility that I welcome you to this country. I believe this to be the first time in history that any sovereign has of a conference of all the nations of the world. All nations are suffering from a common ill. This is shown only too clearly by the rise in the figures of unemployment. The meaning of these figures in terms of human suffering has been my constant concern in recent years, as it has been the concern of every one of you here today, upon whom the responsibility of government has rested.
From the royal broadcasts of the early 30s, it is quite obvious that the sufferings caused by the Depression were a constant concern to the King and to his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Even, for example, at the launching by the Queen of the great liner named after her, the Queen Mary, the King returns to the same subject.
As a sailor, I have deep pleasure in coming here today to watch the launching by the Queen of this great and beautiful ship. For 3 years, her uncompleted hull has lain in silence on the stocks. We grieve for what the suspension meant to thousands of our people. We rejoice that with the help of my government, it has been possible to lift that cloud and to complete this ship. May her life among great waters spread friendship among the nations.
I am happy to name this ship the Queen Mary. I wish success to her and to all who sail in her.
At about the same time, the Prince of Wales, by now an experienced broadcaster, was speaking on the need for more voluntary services to help keep up the morale of the unemployed.
I am glad to tell you that today there are over 2,000 active voluntary schemes in existence all over the country, doing really valuable work in helping countless men and women who are unemployed to find something useful to do in the long empty hours of their unoccupied leisure.
But the Prince of Wales was not content merely to make speeches about voluntary services. He knew that drastic remedies were needed to solve the problem of unemployment. After all, like everyone else, he could see the unemployed begging. He might even have heard these unemployed Welsh miners singing in the streets of London. The Prince insisted on visiting the depressed areas to see the problem at first hand. Years later, as the Duke of Windsor, and speaking from his home in France, he remembered the difficulties he sometimes got into because of this insistence.
I had a trip organized to go and visit some of the depressed areas. I went to Wales and different parts of Britain, and this one I think was up in the Northumberland. And when Stanley Baldwin got to hear of this trip, he called me to the House of Commons and said he'd like to talk to me about it. And he said, "Why are you going up there? Got a lot of other important things to do?" So I said, "No, Mr. Baldwin," I said, "I think that it is very important to see how we can't give these people employment. Some of them have been out for 10 years. We try and help them give them something in the long leisure time that they have." Now, Mr. Baldwin suddenly became conscious of the fact that he and his government had actually done very little to alleviate the plight of the unemployed. So he said, "Who suggested that you should go?" I said, "As a matter of fact, I'm going under the auspices of Sir Alexander Leith, who was chairman of the Conservative Association in Northumberland." "Oh," he said, "wonderful man, great friend of mine. I'm delighted, and I do hope that you will have a good trip." When I left he was Prime Minister at that time, I thought to myself that he was beginning to drag me in to politics a little too far. And as we all know, politics is the one thing that the royal family has to avoid, however much they might like to express their opinions.
In 1935, there was a cheerful interlude in the midst of the general gloom. The Silver Jubilee celebrations to mark the 25th year of King George V's reign.
At the close of this memorable day, I must speak to my people everywhere. Yet, how can I express what is in my heart? As I passed this morning through cheering multitudes to and from St. Paul's Cathedral, as I thought there of all that these 25 years have brought to me and to my country and my empire, how could I fail to be most deeply moved? Words cannot express my thoughts and feelings. I can only say to you, my very dear people, that the Queen and I thank you from the depths of our hearts for all the loyalty and, may I say, the love with which this day and always you have surrounded us.
the end of that same year, 1935, the King made his last Christmas broadcast. The last time, in fact, that his voice was heard on the air.
As I close, I send you all, and not least to the children who may be listening to me, my truest Christmas wishes, and those of my dear wife, my children, and grandchildren who are with me today. I add a heartfelt prayer that wherever you are, God may bless and keep you always.
And less than a month later, we heard this most moving announcement.
This is London. Following bulletin was issued at 9:25. The King's life is moving peacefully towards its close. Signed, Frederick Willans, Stanley Hewitt, Dawson of Penn.
Whereas it hath pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late sovereign Lord, King George V, of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the imperial crown of Great Britain, Ireland, and all other his late Majesty's dominions is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. We therefore do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, publish and proclaim that the high and mighty Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become our only lawful and rightful liege lord, Edward VIII.
And 7 days after the proclamation of the new king came the funeral of the old king.
The coffin halts before the door. The king stands saluting at the bottom of the steps, ready to lead the procession into the chapel. The state landau, drawn by the Greys, draws up. Her Majesty Queen Mary dismounts and mounts the steps. Once more, the coffin moves forward. The archbishops of Canterbury and York wait to receive it. And there, in that ancient and historic chapel, the congregation waits, moves within, disappears from sight, and followed by the thoughts and homage of the world, so a great king passes to his rest.
King Edward VIII's reign lasted just over 10 months and was to end with a farewell speech broadcast from Windsor Castle, which has already taken its place as one of the most famous statements in the history of the British people.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own.
I have never wanted to withhold anything. But until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor. And now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart. You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. But I want you to understand that in making up my mind, I did not forget the country or the empire, which, as Prince of Wales and lately as king, I have for 25 years tried to serve. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. And I want you to know that the decision I have made has been mine and mine alone. And now we all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the King.
And on the 12th of May, 1937, His Majesty King George VI was crowned.
His Majesty is seated in King Edward's chair. The Archbishop, assisted by the other bishops, moves down from the altar. The Dean of Westminster brings the crown. The Archbishop takes it from him and lays it reverently on the King's head. The peers and the Kings of Arms put on their coronets. And His Majesty, King George VI, is acclaimed.
It is with a very full heart I speak to you tonight. Never before has a newly crowned king been able to talk to all his peoples in their own homes on the day of his coronation. Never has the ceremony itself had so wide a significance, for the dominions are now free and equal partners with this ancient kingdom. And I felt this morning that the whole empire was in very truth gathered within the walls of Westminster Abbey.
The quiet and reassuring voice of King George VI. But in those late 30s, another, more ominous voice was also being broadcast.
für unseres Reiches Macht, für seine Größe und für seine Herrlichkeit, jetzt und immer. Deutschland, Sieg heil!
So menacing were these sounds that the former king, now the Duke of Windsor, having deliberately kept out of public affairs for 2.5 years, felt impelled, while visiting the First War battlefield of Verdun, to sound a note of warning.
I speak simply as a soldier of the last war, whose most earnest prayer it is that such cruel and destructive madness shall never again overtake mankind. Whatever political disagreements may have arisen in the past, the supreme importance of averting war will, I feel confident, impel all those in power to renew their endeavors to bring about a peaceful settlement.
But only 4 months after the Duke's speech, Germany had invaded Poland, and Europe was again at war.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war.
But at home, the only immediate signs of war, apart from a false air raid alarm, were the groups of school children being evacuated from London's mainline stations.
1 minute, the train's leaving in 1 minute, is it? Well, now, children, come on, give them a song as you go. What about giving them the Lambeth Walk? Come on. Come on.
And on Armistice Day, 1939, Her Majesty the Queen speaks of the hardship that war...
Many of you have had to see your family life broken up. Your husband going off to his allotted task. Your children evacuated to places of greater safety. The King and I know what it means to be parted from our children. And we can sympathize with those of you who have bravely consented to this separation for the sake of your little ones.
Some of the children were sent overseas, and to them, the 2 young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, sent a special message.
When peace comes, remember, it will be for us, the children of today, to make the world of tomorrow a better and happier. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret.
Good night, children.
Good night, and good luck to you all.
And the King, in the first Christmas broadcast of the war, reflects some of the doubts and puzzlements of the phony war period.
A new year is at hand. we cannot tell what it will bring. If it brings a peace, how thankful we shall all be. If it brings us continued struggle, we shall remain undaunted. Meantime, that we may all find a message of encouragement in the lines which in my close I would like to say to you. I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way. And may that almighty hand guide all.
Ships of all kinds have plied to and fro across the channel of the enemy's bombers, utterly regardless of the perils, to bring out as many as possible of the trapped BEF. There was every kind of ship that I saw coming in this morning, and every one of them was crammed full of tired, battle-stained and blood-stained British soldiers. Some were completely exhausted, but the most amazing thing was that practically every man was reasonably cheerful, and most of them managed to smile.
And throughout all those grim war years, the King's broadcasts gave a moving, almost Churchillian account of the progress of the war.
Time and again, during these last few months, I have seen for myself battered towns and cities of England, and I have seen the British people facing their ordeal.
Germany calling, Germany calling. Here are the Reichscenter ambush, Station Bremen and Station DXB on the 31 meter band.
I have decided to create at once a new mark of honor for men and women in all walks of civilian life. I propose to give my name to this new distinction, which will consist of the George Cross, which will rank next to the Victoria Cross and the George Medal for wider distribution.
No! on the southern shores of the Mediterranean, the 1st and 8th Armies, our fleets and air forces are advancing towards each other, heartened and greatly fortified by the timely and massive armies of the United States. Blows have been struck by the armies of the Soviet Union, the effects of which cannot yet be measured on the minds and bodies of the German people.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is a special bulletin read by John Snagg. D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress.
I could just see ahead of me the now fairly calm waters of the English Channel, and I'm hoping in a few minutes to get the first glimpse of our great invasion armada as they make their way to the coast of France. It's an extraordinary thing to be in this aeroplane, a tiny microcosm poised in space, looking down as history, probably in a few moments, will begin to unroll itself before my eyes.
4 years ago, our nation and empire stood alone against an overwhelming enemy with our backs to the wall. Once more, a supreme test has to be faced. This time, the challenge is not to fight to survive, but to fight to win the final victory for the good cause. I hope that throughout the present crisis of the liberation of Europe, there may be offered up earnest, continuous, and widespread prayer.
Flying bomb, or doodlebug as we called the V1, with its terrifying pause after the cut-off of the engine, before it came down and exploded.
We do not know what awaits us when we open the door of 1945. But if we look back to those earlier Christmas days of the war, we can surely say that the darkness daily grows less and less. The lamps which the Germans put out all over Europe, first in 1914 and then in 1939, are being slowly rekindled.
But there was also Hitler's other secret weapon, the V2 rocket, which descended from the sky and exploded without any warning at all.
This is London Calling. Here is a news flash.
The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Now we're breaking into our programs with some splendid news from Moscow. Berlin has fallen. This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news. During the first few moments of this bulletin, the war in Europe is coming to its official end. 1 minute past midnight is the time fixed for the cessation of hostilities.
This is London, His Majesty King George VI.
Today, we give thanks to Almighty God for a great deliverance. Speaking from our empire's oldest capital city, a war battered, but never for one moment daunted or dismayed, speaking from, I ask you to join with me in that act of thanksgiving for Germany and the enemy who drove all Europe into war has been finally overcome.
A few months later came the Japanese surrender and the end of hostilities throughout the world. King George VI's first Christmas broadcast after the war had a special message for the young.
Do not judge life by what you have seen of it in the grimness and waste of war, nor yet by the years of peace. Have faith in life at its best, and bring to it your courage, your hopes, and your sense of humor. It is the birthright of the young.
And it was about now that the young Princess Elizabeth began to take an increasing share of royal duties. 1947 was to be a particularly memorable year for her. First of all, the royal journey to South Africa. King, as we head, comes across a badly stranded rope lying on the deck of HMS Vanguard.
Captain Agnew, what have we here? It's in a sorry plight.
Why, sir, that is the main brace.
What, the main brace? Have it spliced!
Aye, aye, sir. Bosun, splice the main brace.
Main brace!
Then, at Cape Town, Princess Elizabeth's very serious dedication speech on her 21st birthday.
There is a motto which has been borne by many of my ancestors. A noble motto, I serve. Those words were an inspiration to many bygone heirs to the throne when they made their knightly dedication as they came to manhood. I should like to make that dedication now. It is very simple. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
In the autumn of that year, her engagement to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, and in November, the wedding, which brought a much-needed touch of glamour and romance to those rather austere post-war years.
While the register has been signed in St. Edward's Chapel, we outside prepare for the last great pageantry and ceremony of the morning, the procession of the bride and bridegroom. Once again, the clergy come forward carrying the glowing cross of Westminster, and behind them now, form the 5 banners of the Abbey, glowing in lovely embroidery of greens and yellows and gold. The archbishops come out to take their place in the procession, but it's the Dean of Westminster who again, by ancient right, will escort the bridal pair to the great west door. The bridesmaids stand waiting to take up the train, and above the chapel, the trumpeters, framed with all the Gothic elegance of the Abbey arches, stand now like a medieval painting, raising their trumpets, waiting for the signal to send the echoes flying in the great bridal fanfare, which Sir Arnold Bax, the Master of the King's Music, has specially written for the occasion. And as the sound of the fanfare echoes to the Abbey, the organ will play the bridal march.
(1948) was another notable year for the royal family. In April, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth celebrated their silver wedding.
It has been an unforgettable experience to realize how many thousands of people there are in this world who wish to join in the thankfulness we feel for the 25 years of supremely happy married life which have been granted to us. Looking back over those years, nobody can deny that they have been, for all of us who have lived through them, full of difficulty, of anxiety, and often of sorrow. On me, in my endeavor to fulfill my appointed task, they have laid a heavy burden. I make no secret of the fact that there have been times when it would have been almost too heavy, but for the strength and comfort which I have always found in my home. I will now ask the Queen to speak to you.
I would like to add to the King's my own words of gratitude. There must be many who feel as we do, that the sanctities of married life are in some ways the highest form of human fellowship. affording a rock-like foundation on which all the best in the life of the nation is built.
And in the same year, on the 14th of November, the following announcement was made.
This is the BBC Home Service. It has just been announced from Buckingham Palace that Her Royal Highness Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, was safely delivered at 9:14 p.m. and that Her Royal Highness and her son are both doing well.
More and more cars are arriving, and there seems no dispersing. It's going to stay here tonight by the look of it, and every now and again a cheer goes up and the crowd start to chant, "We want Philip," or "We want the King." The Duke of Edinburgh has already appeared once in the balcony and had a rousing reception. The crowd's a jolly good fellow, and now they're doing their best to get him out again. And we're looking up to the grey facade of the palace. It's clear that the moon comes out occasionally through the clouds, and we see the royal standard flying proudly. And we're looking up to Princess Elizabeth's rooms. They're heavily shuttered and curtained, but our thoughts are there at the moment. It's been an exciting evening. Every arrival to the palace has been cheered. Queen Mary was one of the first to arrive when she heard the news, and this must be a very great moment for her. Like Queen Victoria, she has had the pride of seeing her great-grandchild and seeing the direct succession to the throne assured in her own lifetime.
But soon the illness of the king was to cast a shadow over the nation. Everyone had admired the courage with which this shy man had tackled the daunting tasks of a monarch. And nowhere was this courage more dramatically demonstrated than in the Christmas broadcasts, which, in spite of his speech difficulties, he had always insisted should be broadcast live. But in his last Christmas broadcast, in 1951, the king was too ill to do this, and he had to record his message a bit at a time.
As I speak to you today, I would like to wish you, wherever you are, a happy Christmas. We are living in an age which is hard and cruel. And if there is anything that we can offer to the world of today, perhaps it is the example of tolerance and understanding that runs like a golden thread through the great and diverse family of the British Commonwealth of Nations. For the Queen and I wish you all, near and far, a happy Christmas and a prosperous and peaceful New Year.
This is London. It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
Whereas it hath pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late sovereign Lord, King George VI of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown is solely and rightfully come to the High Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, we therefore, the Lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, publish and proclaim that the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become Queen Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen of this realm, and of all her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to whom her lieges do acknowledge all faith and constant obedience with hearty and humble affection.
And throughout the Commonwealth, the same proclamation was being made in different languages.
பிரகடனம். நமது மாட்சிமைமிக்க முடிமன்னர் 6ஆம் ஜார்ஜ் இவ்வுலக வாழ்வை நீத்ததும் நமது சட்டப்பிரகாரம் முடியாட்சி நியாயப்படியும் உரிமைப்படியும் மாண்புமிக்க வீர இளவரசி எலிசபெத் அலெக்சாந்திரா மேரிக்கு வழிவந்துவிட்ட காரணத்தால்.
A week later, and the funeral of King George VI, at which was sung one of his favorite hymns.
Much as it hath pleased Almighty God of his great mercy to take unto himself the soul of our dear brother here departed, we therefore commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection to eternal life through our Lord Jesus Christ.
The coronation was still over a year away, and during that time, of course, the Queen was increasingly involved in royal duties, as was her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, whose speeches already included a welcome dash of slightly irreverent humour, as, for example, in this address to the London Welsh Society.
May I say how delighted I am to be here this evening for a number of reasons, but two of them, first of all, as Earl of Merioneth, and secondly, as Chancellor of the University of Wales. These two positions are very convenient. Because if I was only Earl of Merioneth, I would belong only to North Wales. As it is, the university has a foot in both. So I can therefore tell stories about either North or South Wales, depending on how I feel. I once served with an officer in the Navy whose name was Watkin, and he told me a story which he told me happened in about 1935. Apparently, a man went into a shop in Wales. I won't say which side it was. It doesn't really matter. And he said, have you seen in the papers this terrible fighting and an awful business going on in a place called I can't remember the name. Oh, I have it. Abyssinia. Oh, is it? So the chap he told this to said to him, oh, well, you can never tell what those madmen in either North or South Wales are.
In 1953, at the end of March, came the death of the Queen's grandmother, Queen Mary, whose voice was not often heard in public, but whose regal appearance and bearing made her such a distinctive figure in any photograph of the royal family.
The men of the household cavalry are in all the splendors of their shining cuirasses and their plumed helmets. Their great cloaks, scarlet for the Life Guards, blue for the Royal Horse Guards. Then, behind them, come the men of the Royal Navy. First, their shining white helmets, the Royal Marines, then square, solid, marching ranks of the naval ratings. We listen to their quiet tread, bearing our grief for Queen Mary towards Westminster.
And on June the 2nd, 1953, the crowds lined the streets of London again, this time to cheer Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on her progress to Westminster Abbey for her coronation.
Coach passes us, and the Queen, with the Duke of Edinburgh on her left, smiling happily, waving to the children, a forest of hands and handkerchiefs and caps, everything the children can bring out as the coach passes down the embankment towards Westminster Bridge.
And later, during the service, Her Majesty takes the coronation oath.
Madam, is Your Majesty willing to take the oath?
I am willing.
Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, or possessions, and the other territories to any of them belonging or pertaining, according to their respective laws and customs?
I solemnly promise so to do.
Will you, to your power, cause law and justice in mercy to be executed in all your judgments?
I will.
Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel? Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain in the United Kingdom the Protestant Reformed religion, sustain and preserve inviolable the settlement of the Church of England, and the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government thereof, as by law established in England? And will you preserve unto the bishops and clergy of England and to the churches there committed to their charge all such rights and privileges as by law do or shall appertain to them or any of them?
All this I promise to do.
The Archbishop goes to the altar. The Marquis of Salisbury, carrying the sword of state, stands before Her Majesty, who rises from the chair of estate, and supported by her bishops, the Bishop of Durham on her right, and the Bishop of Bath and Wells on her left, she goes to the altar to take the coronation oath. The Archbishop holds the Bible. Her Majesty kneels, places her right hand upon the Bible, and makes her solemn promise.
The things which I have herebefore promised, I will perform and keep, so help me God.
The Queen kisses the Bible. The Lord Great Chamberlain brings the silver standish, and upon it a parchment copy of the oath. This is the only time that Her Majesty makes a written contract with her people. Still kneeling, Her Majesty signs the oath.
And broadcasting to her peoples that evening, the Queen said,
"The ceremonies you have seen today are ancient,
and some of their origins are veiled in the mists of the past. But their spirit and their meaning shine through the ages, never perhaps more brightly than now. I have in sincerity pledged myself to your service, as so many of you are pledged to mine.
A few weeks after her coronation, the Queen was in Scotland for the ceremony of the Keys at Edinburgh Castle, a symbolic affirmation of Scotland's sovereign rights under the Crown.
Who goes there?
Her Majesty the Queen, and by command of Her Majesty here present, we do lawfully summon, warn, and charge the Governor and Garrison of Edinburgh Castle to open the port and gates of the same, therein to give admittance unto Her Majesty, and unto Her Majesty to deliver the key of the said castle, all of which we do hereby command you strictly to do and forthwith to perform, with certification that an ye fail, ye shall answer at your highest peril.
And within 5 months of the coronation, the Queen and Prince Philip were off on a long tour of the Commonwealth, one of the many tours which have taken them to most parts of the world. No doubt their memories of these tours are somewhat mixed, but at least there were often vigorous national songs to bring welcome relief from the more tedious duties, like this one. And the impact and value of these tours was summed up most succinctly by Mr. Winston Churchill, as he then was.
A symbol of the crown and the preservation through the centuries of the British monarchy have rendered possible a sense of unity to which time and space, which so often divide, have become the servants and cease to be the masters. But all this evolution would not survive the changes of the modern world if it were not sustained and refreshed by the wonderful personal contributions made in recent generations by the occupants and heirs to the throne.
The late 50s brought the first televised Christmas Day broadcast, an important royal visit to France, and the creation of Prince Charles as Prince of Wales at the Commonwealth Games in Cardiff.
The British Empire and Commonwealth Games in the capital, together with all the activities of the Festival of Wales, have made this a memorable year for the Principality. I have therefore decided to mark it further by an act which will, I hope, give as much pleasure to all Welshmen as it does to me. I intend to create my son Charles Prince of Wales today.
When he is grown up, I will present him to you at Carnarvon.
2 years later, in 1960, another milestone in the life of the royal family, the wedding of Princess Margaret to Mr. Anthony Armstrong-Jones.
And here now comes Her Royal Highness the bride and her husband, hand in hand. Princess Margaret makes a deep curtsy to her mother and to her sister, the Queen. Mr. Armstrong-Jones bows. And Princess Anne, walking a little distance behind with her charming posy of lilies of the valley, follows after. They walk down with the small bridesmaids who curtsy to them as they go past and will form up behind in procession. And so, as Princess Margaret and her husband approach the organ screen, let us listen to the trumpet tunes and airs by Purcell.
The 60s were a period of consolidation, so far as the present reign is concerned. While London started swinging to the sound of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the Queen went quiet and tried to children from the glare of publicity. But Prince Philip was hardly ever out of the news. With his active interest in many and varied causes, his dislike of humbug, and his frankness of speech, he was a ready gift to journalists, and never more so than when they were on the receiving end of his criticisms. Of the speeches which the Duke made during that period, this brief extract from one on conservation gives some idea of the qualities which he brings to this aspect of his public duties.
I think the simple truth is that everyone of reasonable intelligence has become aware of what is wrong with our environment. They have come to realize that our honeymoon period with science and technology is over. They have come to understand the immense and damaging pressures which have been put upon the countryside and all wild populations on land or in the water. We've now got to settle down and attempt to cope with the consequences. And as so often happens after honeymoons, the consequences are unexpected. And in this case, many of the solutions depend upon informed and intelligent compromise.
It was towards the end of the 60s that the Queen's two elder children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, began to emerge as distinctive personalities in their own right. And the fact that the Prince of Wales agreed to take part in an informal interview program on BBC Radio was a sign of changing times. In the course of the interview, the host realized that he was heir to the throne.
It's one of the most difficult questions, Ed. I suppose it's one that people like to know. I think it's something that dawns on you with the most ghastly, sense. I didn't suddenly wake up in my pram one day and say, yippee, But I think it just dawns on you, slowly, that people are interested in one, and slowly you get the idea that you have a certain duty and responsibility. And I think it's better that way rather than suddenly someone telling you, you must do this and you must do that because of who you are. I think it's one of those things you grow up in.
But of course it was the investiture itself which first brought Prince Charles fully to the forefront of public attention.
I, Charles, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship, and faith and truth I will bear unto thee, to live
After the investiture, a tour of Wales and a visit to a Cymanfa chapel near Swansea.
As always, coming to one of these Cymanfa Gunnies is a wonderful musical experience for anybody, particularly me. And having been to one already in Newquay, I've never forgotten. And it was a great pleasure to come here this evening and to hear you all sing so beautifully and so loudly. I can never get over it. You've got nothing like this in England at all. After today, I have nothing but Welsh ringing in my ears and the voices of Welsh people. I've been most touched by the welcome I've received, and particularly here this evening, and for all your kind words. And I look forward to many more of these sort of occasions. And I think this is a very, very good way of preserving the Welsh language and the Welsh culture here by singing it particularly. And do this, the more people will be interested in it, and I'm sure it will go on to survive many, many generations. Ydych chi canu yn iawn, diolch yn fawr.
Meanwhile, Princess Anne was making a name for herself as an outstanding horsewoman, and as a true daughter of her father in her ability to stand up to the press, even when invited to speak to them at the Institute of Journalists dinner.
Flattered, as I was, by the recent publicity. After all, 3 days in the headlines and every other day inside can't be bad. I felt it was time for the horse's mouth to have its say. I did, however, remember somebody once saying to me how nice it was to see my parents or something on the front of the newspapers, and then adding, all you ever get in newspapers these days is sex and violence. I don't know which category I come in either. However, I wouldn't dream of complaining about you, your behavior, as you're indeed only doing your jobs, and editors, as we all know, would lose them if they didn't get a picture or a story. And if the story is done properly, you can't be popular with everybody all of the time. Anyway, you do tend to be rather a touchy lot when it comes to talking about you.
On the 20th of November, 1972, Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh celebrated the Silver Jubilee of their wedding. Here is the Queen speaking at the banquet in Guildhall, London.
My Lord Mayor, I think everybody really will concede that on this, of all days, I should begin my speech with the words, my husband and I. We, and by that I mean both of us, are most grateful. We're most grateful to you for your generous welcome and for the kind and thoughtful way in which you have expressed the city's loyalty and affection. A marriage begins by joining man and wife together. But this relationship between two people, however deep at the time, needs to develop and mature with the passing years. For that, it must be held firm in the web of family relationships, between parents and children, between grandparents and grandchildren, between cousins, aunts, and uncles. When the bishop was asked what he thought about sin, he replied with simple conviction that he was against it. If I am asked today what I think about family life after 25 years of marriage, I can answer with equal simplicity and conviction, I am for it.
And in somewhat similar light-hearted vein, part of the Queen's speech at the state banquet at Windsor Castle to the Queen and Prince of Denmark on the 30th of April, 1974.
Of course, there was a time, several centuries ago, when the Danes were anything but good news on our east coast. Indeed, we paid them to stay away. Today, I am glad to say that they are heartily welcome throughout the land. And I hope they find the same welcome here as so many British visitors find in Denmark.
But undoubtedly, the glamorous highlight of royal broadcasts in the early 70s was on that November day in 1973, when the Queen came to Westminster Abbey almost exactly 26 years after her own marriage, this time as the mother of the bride, for the wedding of Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips.
Elizabeth Alice Louise.
I am Elizabeth Alice.
Take thee, Mark Antony Peter.
Take thee, Mark Antony Peter.
To my wedded husband.
To my wedded husband.
To have and to hold.
To have and to hold.
From this day forward.
From this day forward.
For better, for worse.
For better, for worse.
For richer, for poorer.
For richer, for poorer.
In sickness and in health.
In sickness and in health.
To love, cherish, and to obey.
To love, cherish, and to obey.
Till death us do part.
Till death us do part.
According to God's holy ordinance.
According to God's holy ordinance.
And thereto I give thee my troth.
And thereto I give thee my troth.
A young girl married in church. But the church is Westminster Abbey, and tens of millions of people watch and listen as she makes her marriage vows. And the fanfares proclaim that she is a member of a family whom fate has placed in an extraordinary and unique position.
"50 Years of Royal Broadcasts" was narrated by Robert Hudson and written by John Laird. The producer was Stephen Williams. A double album BBC record, based on the programme you've just heard, will be available shortly from record shops. Its title is 50 Years of Royal Broadcasts, and its number is REJ 187.